Every client file is different, and proper management is key for timely and effective client service and risk mitigation. In this program, Malcolm Heath, Practice Risk Manager at LawCover, and Malcolm Campbell, Principal at Coleman Gregg Lawyers, discuss the advantages of addressing client matters from a project management perspective and how this approach can manage risk and prevent errors. Hi Malcolm, thanks very much for joining today.
No, my pleasure.
Jumping straight into this topic, one of the main areas of claims we see at LawCover arise in the failure in communications between the solicitor and client, and that's representing 36% of all claims in this past financial year. We've identified the typical causes in this area of these claims, including the failure to advise or the client's instructions were not followed or not obtained, the retainer has not been properly defined, or there has been incomplete explanation of the advice. So Malcolm, how important is it for a solicitor to address the legal work from a project management perspective?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Malcolm. I think a lot of lawyers growing up, coming through the education system, have this romantic idea that that the law is all going to be, fine suits and days in court cross-examining people, and it's going to be about the intellect of the law. But when you actually get into day-to-day practice, it's quite amazing. It's almost turned on its head. It really is, I think, more than anything, a project management role. That the technical law obviously is very, very important, and that is the starting point for all lawyers, of course, but legal work and legal matters are effectively the project management of a problem or an issue. So I think it's absolutely critical, and I personally believe that the most successful lawyers and firms are those that identify the best way to manage those projects, the best way to manage them efficiently, and the best way to structure their day-to-day work so we can plug some of those gaps that you mentioned in the introduction about poor communications with clients. And it is quite amazing that 36%, which has come down recently, which is good. It was up in the 40s for the last few years, but now down into the 30s, that 36% of all claims that LawCover receive relate to poor communications. I was floored by that stat when I first read it many years ago, because I always had the fear as a junior lawyer that I'd be subject of a claim because I didn't have all the answers, or I didn't know the law, or something of a technical nature.
It's
but I think the
fascinating,
stats bear out. And I'm often asking lawyers when I discuss this sort of topic, what was your biggest worry? And I would say 9 out of 10 say, not knowing the law or not having all the answers. So I think the stats bear out that as a profession, we're actually all quite smart people. Unfortunately, where we can fall down is in that communication piece. And back-ending that's often a project management, a byproduct, I should say, of poor project management.
So can I just ask, if a young solicitor starting is looking at joining firms, what are the characteristics of the firm or the principles? Because if they're trying to identify that firm that's got that good project management skill set, how do they sort of find that out? Do they just sort of join and hope?
Yeah. Look, very, very good question. Because I think we all know in life, there's a big difference between perception and reality. And front of house can look all nice and shiny and glossy, but then sort of behind the reception and into the working areas can be a totally different experience. Look, my tips, just through my personal experience, and this doesn't mean that it's always right, but my tips would be do your research on the firm from the outside looking in, but then If you get the opportunity to physically attend an office, and look, in these COVID times, who knows how that recruitment process will sort of develop and be tweaked. But if you do get the opportunity to physically attend the office during the interview process, look at the office, look at how it's organised, look at how neat it is, look at how the staff are managing files, look at how things are organised in a physical sense. I would tend to suggest that a messy office environment is, again, a byproduct of less than perfect project management. In the interview, ask the interviewers the types of systems that are being used, whether they have a focus on sort of investment or reinvestment into the software programs. As a junior, you might not know all of the different programs, so do a bit of research about what are sort of the leading programs that law firms will use, what practice management systems are out there, and that's probably getting a little bit technical, but more importantly for a lawyer on a day-to-day basis, what document management systems are they using? Simple things as what version of Microsoft Office are they using, and things like that, because it will tell you, it won't tell you all the answers, but it will tell you what level of importance they place on providing an infrastructure and resources that enable you or provide you with tools to project manage your work.
Yeah, great points. Thank you for that. And coming into, say, the matter side, how important is developing a working plan for the matter itself?
Yeah, look, I think it's critical on a number of fronts. I think it's critical on the client side of things, in terms of if you, as a client, walk into a meeting with a lawyer and you bring your situation, and it's not always, unfortunately, I think lawyers are a little bit cynical and negatively focused sometimes. We're always associating things with problems. But if you have a situation, it could be a positive situation, you're buying a property or you're going into business, and so it's not necessarily a negative thing, but you come into a meeting with a lawyer and all they're wanting to do is talk about the legal issues, many of which will probably go over your head. You're going to walk away from that meeting often more confused than when you started, and maybe sort of scratching your head at what value you got out of that whole interaction. So on the client front of things, I think it's very important for lawyers to think strategically, but also from an analysis and a working plan point of view, even when speaking with their clients. And that can be as simple as breaking your client interview, as well as the larger matter, but the client interview or conference down into sort of a middle, a beginning and an end. And the middle, so the beginning is introduction, explaining why you understand the meeting has occurred, asking any questions that you might need to just clarify basic details, and then saying, right, this is what we plan to do in this meeting during our time today. I'll get a bit more info out of you. I'll then provide you with some legal analysis, and then at the back end, we'll finish up with a bit of a strategy or a to-do list, or who's going to go away and do what now. You'll then have a client that walks away going, great, I feel like I now have clarity.
Yes.
From the matter management side of things, that's exactly what you should be doing with your matter at the back end between you and your staff, in terms of, right, okay, there's a beginning, a middle and an end with all legal issues. What's our plan? Who's going to do what? When's it going to be done by? What are the key deadlines? Those sorts of things. So I think working plans are critical, and it's the whole thing of if you don't write it down, if you don't put it in a physical form, whether it's electronic on a screen or on a piece of paper, it's very hard to keep track of it, and you can wander from that plan. So I would highly suggest a written working plan. It can be a one-pager. It doesn't have to be a complicated thing. And I'm a big fan of checklists. Yeah. So we developed many years ago what we would call folder checklists, because that was back in the day when everything was quite physical. But, I mean, the checklist was created electronically, so you can now just use it on the screen rather than printing it out. But what it was a skeleton or a map of each of the different key or common stages of certain types of matters. So, for example, if it was an unfair dismissal matter, you would have the initial stages, many of which were not strategic, but file management issues. When were instructions received? Who received them? What's the date of dismissal? Therefore, flowing from what is the deadline to file the application? Has the client been issued the client engagement documents? Have they paid the filing fee into trust? You know, very, very mundane things, but all very important. They were set out in a chronological order. You could write some notes next to it. You ticked it off that it's done and you initialed it. You'd break the matter down into each of what we would call the stages, because there are distinct stages in legal matters, particularly disputes. So we use those as our working plans. And I am yet to come across an area of law where you couldn't create at least a basic checklist or folder checklist for a matter, even if it's only got 5 or 6 stages in it or rows in the checklist. I can't think of an area of law or type of legal matter where you couldn't create a workflow or working plan from it. And one of the beautiful things about having a working plan as well is it avoids scope creep. It helps you estimate costs more accurately because you can see the level of detail that you need to go to. There are also very good tools for supervising junior lawyers because you can see where they're up to on the matter, and rather than them running to you every 5 minutes saying, what do I do next? You say, well, follow the checklist. Once you get to the level that you think you need some help, come and see me, sort of thing. So the working plan, and there's no right or wrong way of doing it, but the working plan on a matter is an amazing tool at so many different levels.
Now, would you give the working plan to the client as well?
Look, what we would do is we would you certainly could. There would be nothing wrong with doing that. You might want to pretty it up a bit, or you might want to frame it in a letter of advice, or have different advices at different stages of the plan. But certainly there would be nothing wrong with providing the plan. It is basically, here's what we're going to do on your matter, and here's the timeframes within which they need to be done. And I certainly have seen many firms provide advices along those lines, and they're very, very good tools. The client then knows straight up, okay, this is what's happening.
It's interesting because this is the area of communications where we see the gaps, and as you're saying, that scope creep, when there's it can be sometimes intentionally done by the client or unintentionally done because it hasn't been clarified as to what the law firm will be doing and what the client will be doing. And what we typically find is if it's done incorrectly at the start of the matter, then that's where the claim will likely result, because if it's wrong at the start, it cascades downwards with more problems.
Yes.
So that's fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, it's been one of the banes of my existence as a lawyer, I've got to say, in terms of, look, costs are important. Law firms exist to provide a legal service to their clients, but also to earn a living from it. So, I mean, I don't think there's any shame in saying, well, we do this to receive income to survive and live, like any profession or job. Whether it's rightly or wrongly, I think law firms have received a bad rap or a negative stereotype around fees, and I certainly think that some firms manage it better than others. But It is very difficult sometimes, particularly at the outset of a matter, to properly scope and cost a piece of legal work. Sometimes you just don't know enough to give a full scope. And the rules and the regulations require you now to provide an estimate of the matter from go to woe. And that can be very difficult. So how can lawyers or how can firms as a general approach that? Again, a way that I've done it and firms that I've been involved have done it, which again doesn't make it right, it's just an example of how it's done, is we take that working plan, which is quite detailed, and we adapt that to being the scope within the costs agreement. Mm-hmm. So, because the working plan sets out what we're going to do, right? So, well, you can just use that as the framework for your scope in your costs agreement, and then you add your pricing to it. Whether you want to go down to the minutiae of pricing each stage or just give a total cost, look, that's up to the firm and up to the type of matter. But that's a great start, right? Like, instead of just giving a 2-line explanation of we're going to help you with your legal matter and give you some advice, or, whatever you might say, you actually have, and it can even be in a table format, which looks similar to your working plan, a quite detailed scope of work. And the client, and so if you haven't given them that working plan during your normal communications, if you set out your fee structure that way in your cost agreement, they'll have it anyway because it's set out in that scope within the cost document. Yeah. So that's a really good way that I think you can help. I'm not going to say it's not a magic solution, but help avoid scope creep and help avoid the client saying, I didn't know you were going to do that and charge me for it, or I expected that you would be doing this and you haven't. Yes. And that's a tip I often talk about with fee disclosures is it's very important to state what you are going to do and what you're going to charge them for, but I think it's equally important that you say what you're not going to do. And I think the examples that I often give are, for example, in a residential conveyance, you might need to make an express note in your fee disclosure that you are not retained or this scope does not include reviewing the real estate agency agreement or reviewing and advising on the pest and building report, because the layperson will assume or could quite easily assume that those are elements of buying a property and therefore assume that the lawyer would deal with those matters and would alert the client to some potential issue if there was one in either of those documents. And so I think it's very important that if you're not going to do that work, that you say so in your fee disclosure, because it can avoid a very nasty and expensive argument with the client if they believed or subsequently assert that they believed that you were going to do that work for that. That's
an excellent points there. Thank you. And we do see that arising claims. Some may not realise that it can be many years later when the actual claim arises from an advice that may have been 5, 7, 10, 15 years earlier. So when that scope of the matter isn't well defined, there's a lot of ambiguity as to who was meant to be doing what. And as we see in our claim statistics and communications, the allegation of failure to advise, the solicitor did not tell me, as close to a quarter of all claims, 24%. And that, as you mentioned, with good scoping, clear communication, documentation, and who's to do what, helps alleviate that problem, and we can extinguish a number of alleged claims when there's appropriate documentation.
Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge for all lawyers, but particularly junior lawyers, because of that stigma that I mentioned before about lawyers and fees. I think that lawyers are, if I can make a generalisation here, typically fearful or stressed or hesitant or uncomfortable to talk about fees with their clients. And I think that then what can sometimes happen is it's just left to assumptions and implications rather than express discussions. And I think sometimes where that scope creep happens is that the lawyer is fearful of picking up the phone or sending an email to the client saying, hey, we've gone over the estimated budget, or happy to do this piece of work, but it's not really in the scope, because the client's going to be dissatisfied, if I can use that politically correct word, as to any change in the fees, or it's already a, in inverted commas, grudge purchase for them. So any discussion, any increase or change in fees is perceived to not going to be received well by the client. And so I think sometimes, the path of least resistance is to just say nothing, issue the bill at the end of the matter, and hope there's no complaint. And we all know that doesn't work.
It's a high-risk strategy. Or there's guilt, and the solicitor decides to do write-offs, and so they're writing off actually justifiable billings.
Yeah.
And
it's a skill. It's a skill that you learn over time to be able to have confident, assertive, not aggressive, confident, assertive discussions with clients about fees at the right times. And I think that if you just adopt an open approach, because there's no mystery to it, right? We're no different to any other service provider. Does a patient balk at paying the doctor's fees? Does anybody question paying the dentist? No, of course they don't. So I think there just needs to be that open discussion of, yes, legal fees can be expensive. They're not always expensive, but they can be expensive in certain circumstances. But what we hope to do as a firm or as a lawyer is show that what we're delivering to you is actually very good value for money. We will have open and free discussions with you about fees. We will let you know if anything arises that is going to change our estimate. So it is a skill. You've got to practice it. Some of the conversations are not pleasant. And they're not pleasant at two levels. They're not pleasant with the client, and then sometimes they're not pleasant with your superior in terms of budgets and KPIs and those sorts of things. And that's often an unspoken issue that a lot of lawyers have about the pressure to meet their budgets, the pressure to meet their KPIs, which I think can sometimes, not always, but can sometimes drive the billing dilemma or the cost dilemma with the client. Is there's pressure on the lawyer to bill as much as possible, and there's pressure from the client to keep the bill as low as possible. So it is a very difficult tension.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And excellent points there. I think some of the practice tips drawing from that is, it sounds such a motherhood statement on that clarity of communication, but we have to keep on reinforcing that message, because this is where the claims do arise, and to have that confidence in your fees. I suggest to solicitors to look at really focusing on the value of the work being done and communicate value to client. Many solicitors that I speak to lack that understanding of communicating value, because it's assumed that the work we do is very good, very important, very helpful. The client needs to be told that, and even sophisticated clients. I think it's important to remind all clients of the value of the work that the firm's undertaking.
Oh, 100%. And I think there's actually a bit of pressure sometimes the other way too. I think many lawyers, particularly junior lawyers, undervalue what they do. So, and I think, look, we don't have time to go into the history of the whys, but I think somewhat because of the time-based billing system that has been so prevalent in the legal profession forever, is that, it only took me half an hour. Is that really worth the $1,000 that I quoted the client? And the answer has to be in the work and the service that's provided. And unfortunately, there is sometimes with junior lawyers the short selling of themselves, going, and I'll only put in half an hour time for that. I really should have done that within half an hour, or I don't feel like I can justify that. It's like, well, have the confidence in what you're doing, that it is high quality, that it is value for money, and then that will lead to you being able to have that conversation with the client about the value that you bring to the table. And coming back to one of the comments you made about the communication pieces, I don't know how many times I've spoken with junior lawyers that we've employed that are fresh out of College of Law or whatever it might be, or they might be very early in their career. And I'm talking to them about, look, law is, you come out of uni thinking that the job of law, and I sort of mentioned this early on in our discussion today, that many people think it's going to be 95% researching, writing advices, standing up in court and advocating, and 5% all of the other bits of admin. Well, yeah, it's not. And you learn very quickly that, in my opinion, being a lawyer is 95% about relationship management and project management and 5% about the law. It's the entry level threshold is the law, right? And so, yes, you might have to research things every now and then, and yes, there is a lot of reading involved in law, but 95% of your time and effort in being a lawyer will be around administration, physical file administration, doing other working within the firm, whether it's on marketing or going to events or doing those things, and client management, client relationship building. It'll be 5% doing legal work. And I think that if you can develop client relationship skills, the conversations about costs fade away into the back. You still have them, but they're not painful, and the clients don't balk at it because you've already got a good connection and a good relationship with the client, and you've built a certain level of trust. Doesn't mean you can go and charge whatever you want, but you've built a certain level of trust that the client will be saying, well, John Smith, my lawyer, is a straight shooter. He tells me when there's a problem. He'll pick up the phone. We'll have a good discussion. I feel that his bills are fair. I perceive good value out of it. I'm happy to keep using them. Whereas if you have a situation where the client's saying, I don't understand what he says, I get these bills, I don't feel like I've got any value out of it, I don't really understand what's going on, I just get these really long letters, that's when the client's not going to perceive the value. So I think there's some really, really important skills. And, without getting too sort of academic about it, there's actually been quite a few studies in the medical profession around medical negligence, or what we would call professional negligence claims. And it's quite amazing that the studies tend to bear out that the distinguishing features between doctors who had claims made against them and doctors that didn't have claims made about them had nothing to do with the skill of the medical practitioner in a technical sense or the services provided. It was how they talked to their clients, the time they spent with them, and the explanations that they gave. There was no difference in the quality of information given or the quality of the services provided. It was all around how they communicated with their clients, typically what you would refer to as bedside manner.
Exactly, yeah. I've noted some of those studies, and it's fascinating to see that and the parallels within the legal profession as well on those communication skills. Look,
yeah, it's quite amazing. I mean, like some of the things that they said, and I think Wendy Levinson, who's from the University of Toronto, is sort of one of the world's leading researchers in physician-patient communication. And in one of the studies that she did, they actually selected a group of doctors. Half of them had never been sued and the other half had been sued at least twice. And the recording patient interviews of that group of doctors, the doctors who had never been sued spent more than 3 minutes longer per patient on average. They were more likely to make orientating comments such as, okay, what I'll do first is I'll examine you, then we'll talk the problem over, and at the end you can ask me any questions you might have. Or they'd sort of ask leading questions like, oh, okay, that's quite interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about that? And there'd be sort of a bit of humour and a bit more personalisation of what they were doing. They gave the same information. They provided the same service, but it was just the way in which they did it. And that was the only key difference between the two groups of doctors. It's amazing.
It is. It's fascinating. Yeah. I'm just going to move on our last topic on file reviews and your perspective on their importance. How often should they be done, and how should they be done?
Yeah, look, it's I'll go straight back to my earlier comment about laws. 95% about file management, client relationships, and administration, and this is file reviews is part of that 95%. It's not. It might not feel like important or valuable time that you're spending, and you might not be able to put it down on your fee sheet or bill a client for it, but it's really critical. I mean, if you don't have some sort of system of file review, well, firstly, if you've got junior solicitors, how are you discharging your obligation of supervision? But also, even if you are all solicitors that hold practicing certificates not requiring supervision, you're really just all working in silos within the same firm. So, yeah, look, I think file reviews are imperative. It's a difficult question to answer. How often should you be doing them and how should you be doing them? I think it's dependent on the type of work you're doing, because different types of work will have different life cycles. So residential conveyancing, very quick turnaround of a matter. I'm not therefore suggesting that you should do a review every 5 to 6 weeks so you capture every file. Well, no, that's not going to work. That's not practical. You're not ever going to get any actual work done if you do that. But your review system would probably have to make sure that you have a cross-section of all files at any point in time. I think it should be done, depends on your resources and how you're structured, but maybe once every quarter, maybe once every 6 months. If you're doing a physical file review, as in taking a cross-section of files and then reviewing them in detail, yeah, look, I think if you're doing it any more frequently than that, it's a lot of time that you're spending on them. If it's a more informal review where you might say, grab me your 3 most difficult files at the moment, let's have a coffee and a chat for half an hour about them. Look, you could probably do that every couple of weeks or every month or so with your lawyers. So it's very dependent on what it is that you're doing. I think, though, what you need to do in a file review is you as a firm need to identify what are the things that we feel are critical on each file to make sure that they are on track. So I would be looking at things like, is there a cost disclosure on the file? Is there something like, have we verified the client's identity? Where are we at in the fee estimate versus the WIP recorded or the fees billed? So that's your admin side of things that you're reviewing. On the legal side of things, you might want to be checking that there are relevant deadlines or limitation periods recorded properly in your practice management system, or in your document management system, depending on how that works within your firm. And then you'd be wanting to look to see what sort of written advices might be on the file. So some firms will have standard advices that go out in set types of matters. So you might want to be checking those sorts of things as well. But I'd have a bit of a hit list of, say, 8 to 10 key things that you want to make sure are present on every file, and just be able to tick off on those as you go.
Yeah, thank you. No, fabulous. That's excellent. I think that really is. We could talk about this area for hours and hours. But I'd like to thank you for your time to cover many issues about the matter and the matter management, particularly focusing on scoping and the plan, the working plan as well. And as we come back to the critical component being the communications and the skill of these solicitors' communicating effectively to the client and eliciting the right information from the client as well, of course, coming back to help reduce where we're at with 36% of claims arising from this area. Malcolm, thank you so much for your time today.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Risk on Air by Law Cover. Join us for the next episode and subscribe to stay up to date.